Morning. I appreciated very much the warm song service we had, and especially the humble prayer, Brother Kenny. We have a lot that we need to be praying on for this morning. I see Brother Gill over here. Brother Gill, do you have a update first on Brother Jerry Lynn?
Brother Jerry's had a surgery. His vital signs are good. He is back in his room, still a little bit confused. We don't have the results from the doctor yet.
Okay. Thank you, Brother Gill. I appreciate all those that have spent time the last couple of days, especially helping Brother Jerry and I know Brother Gill went over last night. He and Sister Val and Shannon appreciate their help and their devotion to him. And then Brother Gill went back this morning and was with him. What I want to talk to you about this morning, what's on my mind, is I want to talk to the ladies. Now, if the Lord be with me, I'm going to preach to everybody. The men need to hear this too, but my focus is on the ladies this morning. I want to talk to you about women's rights. Women's rights have changed a lot over the years, and we know in America we have great women's rights. And in fact, we've reached a level where last time we had a lady who was on the ticket for vice president, and this next time may have one where a woman will be on the ticket for president. Women's rights have changed a whole lot. And we take a lot for granted now that we have the rights that we have, especially if you look at, all you got to do really is look at some of the other countries, especially over in the Middle Eastern culture, in the Muslim Islamic world, and look and compare, and you will see the rights that women had back in the times of Christ. Because what those countries observe, the Islamic countries observe, is not a lot different than where it was at the time of Christ came along for women's rights. We know if you go over there today, women are required to wear a veil if they're out in public. They can't do anything without the consent of their husbands. The husbands now can ask for a divorce and get a divorce. Women are not allowed to divorce their husbands on any grounds. They're not allowed to talk to other men, even mostly in their own household. Even when they have them over to eat, they're not allowed to eat with them or talk with the other men. And men, under their religious law, men have the right to abuse, not only physically but sexually, their wives without recourse, and it's allowed by their religion. And they have a right to bring their wives into submission by physical force. And that's allowed and encouraged if that's what it takes. All you have to do is look at those areas today, and you will see the long way we have come with women's rights, especially in the Western world, the Western Christian world, and over here, especially even America and in Europe. Look back at ancient world, but the times of Christ, and we know on Wednesday nights we've been studying about Paul's travels, and he's in the area right now where he's traveling over in Greece, country of Greece. Let me tell you about the country of Greece. In doing a little research, the country of Greece, at the time of Christ, Bible times, women could not leave their home alone without the escort of a man, could not eat or talk again to men or women in that time frame. Men kept their wives basically under lock and key. Women had the status of a slave, very low in priority. They were not allowed to go to schools. As young girls, they were not allowed to speak in public. They were considered inferior, and in Greece, women were considered the root of nearly all evil. You know, in Greece was the place where the poet authored the book, Pandora's Box. And it was based on the fact that women have the ability to unleash evil on the world. They open Pandora's box and evil escapes on the world. That was the status of women, and that's how they were looked upon. Same time in Greece, let's look at Rome a little bit, and how were the women treated in Rome? Women in Rome, low status, they were under the absolute control of their husband. The husband, in fact, legally owned the wife and owned all her possessions. Whatever possessions the wife brought into marriage, the man owned those, took ownership of them. They had the power of life and death over their wives. Divorce was easy for a man. Woman was not allowed to have a divorce. Could not speak in public. And female births were discouraged. Female births in Rome were encouraged to limit one per family. It was important to have male child, but not as important to have female child. We had just enough female child for reproduction purposes, but after you had one female, then the women were encouraged to have a male. To the extent they had females, many times they just allowed them to die. That's how women were looked upon in Rome. Even at that same time, at Greece and in Rome, let's look under Jewish law, which we'll see reflected in the Bible. But under Jewish law at the time of Christ, women were barred from public speaking. They were not allowed to read even scriptures in public or out loud. They could go to the synagogue, but they had to stand at the back of the room and not allowed to say a word. The men came down the front of the synagogue for the worship, but the women had to stand in the back and were not allowed to speak. Men had the right to divorce. They got that, what they claimed from the law of Moses, and the law of Moses had told them that if you're going to divorce your wife, give her a bill of divorcement. Well, men took this as an opportunity that they could get a divorce for whatever reason they wanted to. They'd simply write out a deal of, I'm now divorced from you, hand it to the woman, and basically shove her out the door. She was on her own. Pretty cruel world, pretty insecure world for a lot of women. Many women in that capacity turned to either begging or prostitution. It was tough. They cannot testify, were not allowed to give testimony, even any kind of a setting, even a court of law especially. They were considered incompetent to give testimony, much like a child would be. They were not allowed to speak to any other men. Even under Jewish law, I don't think this conforms all with the law of God, the original law, but this is the way the interpretations was that the Jewish people put on it, the Jewish men. It was the oral law, what we call the traditions. Oral traditions, especially by the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We know now it's a lot different. It's a lot different in this world, thank goodness, as it should be. What caused that difference? What caused that change that we have? The Muslims are still back under the Old Testament practices and traditions. We talked about at the time of Christ, Greece and Rome and even the Jewish people. What's changed that status of women to the level that the women enjoy today? I think it was a man called Jesus. If the Lord be with us for a few minutes, I want to talk to you about this man Jesus. He was the best thing that ever happened to women. Jesus came and changed the perceptions of women. He raised their status, elevated their status. He engaged them. If you read the scriptures, the Gospels are full of examples, and many times lead examples, of how Christ treated women, how he respected them. They were precious to him. He used them many times as examples. He used them many times when you would have thought he would have used men under the old traditions of that day. But he had great respect for the women. He did things with women that shocked the norm of the day. He went against the norm. He changed the attitudes by the direction that he gave us in the New Testament, by the direction of his teaching, by the examples he said. Jesus changed the perception and the status of women. Jesus was a feminist. Probably not as we think of that today. People look on the church today and they think, well, but we encourage the male to have the primary role, and that's a put down of women. No, it's not. Lord, we know, gave roles to men and women. He gave us different roles. We're different. We're so different from each other. I mean, we all know that. And he gave us different roles to play. But I want to, if the Lord be with us, I want to take a little bit of time and go through some of the examples in the New Testament, and let's learn how Jesus treated women. Divorce was a big issue, and this is where women found themselves in a lot of trouble when men would write them a bill of divorce and kick them out the door, and they'd have to turn to begging or prostitution. Let's first, for those of you who have your Bibles, I want to start with Matthew 19. Matthew 19:1, where Jesus talked about divorce. Jesus was traveling here, and a great multitude was following them. Verse 3, and the Pharisees also came unto him. The Pharisees were the old controllers of the Jewish law, and especially the oral law, and they controlled a lot of the attitudes about women. Pharisees also came to him, tempting him, and saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Whatever you want to, whatever reason. You get displeased with her, you can put her away, you can divorce her. And he answered and said unto them, have ye not read that which he made them at the beginning, made them male and female? He said, The way you treat them is not the way God set it up. And said, quoting the Old Testament, quoting back in Genesis, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh." Man and woman together are one flesh. That's not the way they were treated then. Women weren't treated like they were the same flesh as the men. "Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let no man put asunder." And they said unto him, "Then why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away?" And he said, because Moses did that in that time because the hardness of the men's heart, of the people's heart. He wanted wives to be able to have a proof that they were actually divorced and could move forward. Verse 9, "And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whoso marrieth her which is put away doth commit adultery." The Lord says, listen, men, you got a problem if you're divorcing your wife. There's only limited reasons you can divorce your wife. He gave women tremendous rights when he gave this decree to the Pharisees. You cannot divorce a woman for just any reason you want to. Change the whole status right there. In his teaching, he was very clear on that. We go back to another example, if you would. Turn back with me into Matthew chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount. This was Jesus' teaching on adultery when he gave probably the greatest sermon he's ever given, anyone's ever given, Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, beginning verse 27, not but 2 verses here. "Ye have heard it said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery." He's quoting from the Ten Commandments here. This is Jesus' teaching again. He says, you're not supposed to commit adultery, men. "But I say unto you that whosoever looketh upon a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." He condemned a lot of men with that statement. He said, we're not to look upon women with lust in our heart, other than perhaps our wives. We're not to look upon other men. Now, back in that time when men treated women like slaves, you know they did this a lot. Men were that way. They lusted after a lot of women in their hearts especially. He condemned them for looking at a woman wrongfully. Jews at that time, and a lot of people had blamed adultery and those types of situations on the women because the women were looking seductive. They were looking, and they placed the blame on them. Jesus reversed it and said, no, the blame also goes on you men. You need to change your hearts. You need to limit your minds. You don't even think. If you look upon a woman in lust, then that's adultery. He changed the way men think with these statements. Go over here to John 8:4. I'm going to skip around several places because I'm going to give you different examples. But I want to show you what Jesus did to change the thinking of the people at the time regarding women. Go over here to John chapter 8. Jesus went into the Mount of Olives, and in the early morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him. He had a big crowd. And he sat down and taught them, and the scribes and the Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that we should stone her. What sayest thou? Now they're trying to set him up where he can't win or lose. He was preaching love, and if he said, well, stone her, then that goes against what he's preaching about forgiveness and stone her. If he didn't say stone her, then he was violating the old law. Problem was, that wasn't the law. Woman caught in adultery, the law didn't say stone her. If you go back and look at Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it's twice in those. It says you stone the man and the woman. You stone them both. They kind of left that out, didn't they? He put them on equal footing. Jesus returned them to equal footing. They said that tempting him, and he stooped down, wrote in the sand with his finger. And then they continued asking him. He lifted himself up, and he said, He that is without sin among you, let him cast a stone at her. Who in this room is not sinners? This woman is sinned, but who in here is not a sinner? As my dad said, it was like turning on the light and watches the cockroaches run. They scattered, didn't they? They all heard it, and they began to leave one at a time and get out of the room. The oldest ones left first because they knew they were sinners. He condemned men in the same level as he condemned the women. as they had condemned the women. He leveled the playing field. And when they all had left, he said, Woman, where are thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee here? She said, No, Lord. And he said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. Jesus hated the sin, but he loved the sinner. He elevated women's status on these three examples on adultery, which was a big issue at the time. Men, when they just got tired of a woman, they'd kick her out. Jesus said, you can't do that anymore. You can't go remarry and do that. Can't do that anymore. And he elevated their status. And the law was, and they were quoting it wrong, they had over a period of time practiced it differently, practiced it wrongfully, in such a manner that they were making up their own law, and Jesus set them straight. And it's changed the practice. From that time forward, it has changed the practice and the view of women, how we look at them, especially in line of divorce. As we know, in the Christian world these days, women can get a divorce as easy as men. We have our rules in the church, and we try to follow them as Jesus taught. But Jesus changed that long time standing. For hundreds of years, women couldn't ask for a divorce for any reason. A man could get a divorce for any reason. Jesus changed that. When he did, he elevated the status of women. Go with me next to Luke chapter 13, a little different direction. Luke chapter 13, beginning in verse 10. Jesus was teaching in the synagogue on a Sabbath day. He was teaching there, and he looked, and in the back of the room it says, and behold, remember the women had to go to the back of the room, not allowed to talk, not allowed to read from the scriptures. The men didn't talk to them, but they were allowed to stand in the back of the room and listen. Behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years. She'd had a problem 18 years, and was bowed together and could in no way wise lift herself up. You've seen people who bend over at the hip. Couldn't raise up. 18 years she'd been this way. And when Jesus saw her in the back of the room, hey, you, come here. Jesus had a way of finding women who otherwise might be, people would leave alone. You know, there must be something wrong with her. She must be a sinner to be bowed over like that. Has some problem. Jesus saw her and called her to the front. When he saw her, he called her to him and said unto the woman, Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. And all that crowd and all these Jewish leaders down front, all the rabbis and all the priests in the temple, he looks in the back of the room and sees a woman, a lowly, low-life woman. Says, Woman, come here. He healed her of her infirmity. She was able to stand upright. And when he laid his hands on her, now look, he's already violated 3 problems here. Saw a woman in the back of the room and recognized her and called her to come up. He didn't speak to women, especially the teachers didn't speak to women, not their own wives. He called her down to the front. This crippled woman who nobody else would care for, called her down to the front and said, talked to her and said, Woman, thou hast loosed from thine infirmity. You got these priests going, what's he doing talking to this old crippled woman? Now, he laid his hands on her. You don't put your hands on women. Not that in that day, especially someone who's not your wife. Christ laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. It didn't sit well with the priests. The ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation. He said, What in you world? Because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day, and he said unto the people, he didn't say it to Jesus, he said to all the people, hey, there are 6 days in the week you can come here and get healed. You don't come here and get healed on the Sabbath. That woman made a mistake for even coming here on the Sabbath to get healed. And he criticized it. Then the Lord answered him and said, Thou hypocrite, doth not each one of you on the Sabbath day loose his ox or his ass from the stall and lead him away to watering? Don't you take your animals, your stock animals, out of the barn and go let them have a drink of water on the Sabbath day? Have to, they'll die. And they all knew they did. You'll do that, but you won't let this woman be healed on the Sabbath? And ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham? Wait a minute. We had sons of Abraham. That's where all the men were. Nobody called the women daughters of Abraham. Women, you have equal standing under Abraham as do the men. You're a daughter of Abraham. Nobody had ever said this before about the women. Nobody had ever said it. Jesus recognized this poor little crippled woman, healed her, brought her to the front of the room, down there where she's not supposed to be, gave her status down in the front row with all the other men, and said, And ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan hath bound, lo, these 18 years, be loosed from her bond on this Sabbath? And when he had said these things, all his adversaries were ashamed. Made all the men ashamed, didn't he? And all the people rejoiced for all the glorious things that were done by him. He changed. Look what he's doing to the status of women in this time. It's influenced Christian beliefs since that day. When you talk about women's rights, Jesus started women's rights with here. Turn with me now to Luke chapter 10. If I can find my spot. Luke chapter 10, verse 38. Now, I preached on this before. This is about Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha were sisters. They were brothers of Lazarus. We'll talk about him again in just a second. They were brothers of Lazarus. They hosted Jesus in their home. He went and stayed in their home, and they were in Bethany, a few miles outside of Jerusalem. He stayed in their home a number of times. Verse 38 of Luke 10. Now it came to pass as they went that he entered into a certain village, Bethany, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. And Martha hosted him on a number of occasions. And she had a sister called Mary, not his mother, but had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. Now, wait a minute. You don't dine with the men. You go get in the kitchen, ladies. You stay there, and you don't dine with the men. You especially don't come out and sit at the feet of one of your guest men and listen to him preach. You stay in the back of the room. But first of all, you go get in the kitchen and fix the meal first. Verse 40, but Martha was cumbered about by much serving. She was getting bothered by this. She was having to do all the work in the kitchen. And came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister had left me alone to serve? I'm in the kitchen sweating, and she's out here listening to you preach. She shouldn't be here anyway. She should be back there with me in the kitchen. Bid her, make her, that she come and help me. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things. You're worrying about way too much stuff, Martha. But one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen that good one thing. Mary's made the right decision. She's come down here front at my feet and listened to me preach. She's getting the benefit of the gospel. That tells me, ladies, being in the kitchen is a good chore, but when the services start, you need to be in here in the auditorium. And you have as much right to the front row as the men do. That's the lesson he's given Martha. He's elevated the status of women in the church. You have just as much right to hear the gospel preached. Now, again, we've got different roles, and those are clear later on, other places in the Bible. But Jesus elevated the status of all the women. But one thing is needful, and Mary has chosen that good part. She chose the right route, which shall not be taken away from her. You've got, as we've said under the Constitution, certain unalienable rights given to you by our Father. And Jesus said this is one of them, the right to come and hear the gospel preached down front and listen good and careful. It's okay to spend time in the kitchen. You ladies do wonderful jobs in the kitchen, but don't use that as a reason not to come in and hear the gospel preached. Go with me back to Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7, beginning in verse 36. This is where Jesus went and ate with Simon the leper. I need to move along here. Beginning in verse 36 of Luke 7. And one of the Pharisees, this was Simon the leper, one of the Pharisees desired that he would eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. Now the Pharisees don't ask them there because they're friends. They were always asking him to try to trick Jesus, to try to put him on the spot, to try to embarrass him. But Jesus accepted the invitation, and he went down, and they sat down to eat. Now, you know, they have a table with food on it, and there's several kind of reclining couches around the way they ate then, and so everybody takes their seat around the table. Jesus now hadn't washed. You're not supposed to touch the table if you haven't washed. So we'll see that in just a moment. And behold, a woman in the city. I mean, she's probably a street lady. I mean, she's got some problems. She's a sinner. If you go read Matthew and Mark version of this, you'll find out that she was clearly labeled a sinner. A woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat at the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment. She brought an ointment and stood at his feet behind him weeping, and began to wash his feet with her tears, and did wipe them with the hair of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee which had bidden him, when he had invited him, Simon saw this, he spake unto himself, saying, This man, if he's truly a prophet, would have known who and what manner this woman is that has touched him, for she's a sinner. If this guy's as big a deal as we're supposed to be, what's he doing, eating and letting this woman, sinning woman, touch him? And Jesus answering him said, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. Let me talk to you, Simon. And he said, Master, go on. He said, there was a certain creditor that had two debtors. The one he owed 500 pence apiece, and the other owed 50. When they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me therefore, which one of them loved him the most? Simon answered and said, Well, I suppose he to whom he forgave the most. And he said, You have answered it rightly. Now look what happens next. Verse 44, and he turned to the woman. He turned to the woman, away from Simon, turned his back on Simon. He turned to the woman, but he spoke to Simon. He's looking at this woman that's down at his feet, and he's talking to Simon behind his back, which you weren't supposed to do. You didn't ever turn your back on the host to speak to someone, especially a lowly woman, a sinning woman off the street. Look what Jesus did here. He said, Seest thou this woman? I entered thy house, and you gave me no water to wash my feet or my hands. You didn't. You were trying to embarrass me. So you didn't give me any water like you'd normally give your guest. But she hath washed my feet with tears. She did more for me than you did, and this is your house, and you're supposed to be host. Wipe them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss. You didn't give me the standard routine kiss on the cheek when you invited a guest to your house. But this woman, since the time that I walked in the door, has not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil did thou not anoint. You didn't put any oil on my head. But this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. And he's looking at her the whole time. That'd be a great feeling to have Jesus looking at your eyes and telling you these things. This woman's kissed my feet. She's wiped her hands. She's washed my feet. She's anointed my feet with oil. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins which are many are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. He is rebuking Simon right here, big Pharisee, whom invited him into his house, and he's rebuking him for his attitude. And he said unto her, Thy sins are forgiven. And they that sat at meat with him began to say with themselves, Who is this that forgiveth sins also? And he said unto the woman, Thy faith hath saved thee, go in peace. Gave honor to the woman. She left with a blessing. And also when he says, The faith has saved thee, go in peace. She was already saved eternally. He gave her timely salvation. She wouldn't have been doing that to Christ if she wasn't one of his saved, one of his elect, one of his chosen. When he says the word saved there, he's talking about timely. She walked out of that house. She had to be feeling 10 foot tall. Look how he made women feel back then. He picked out the lowliest women and made them feel this way. Go to John chapter 11. Again, I apologize for jumping you around here. I'm trying to prove my point with the examples of how, specific examples. And there's a lot more. Luke has 24 in it by itself. I've tried to pick out a few that just shows you. Luke 24, we're back with the house of Mary and Martha again. Their brother Lazarus, they've sent word to Jesus, their brother Lazarus is dead. And so they've asked Jesus to come. Jesus delays getting there and gets there late, and he's been dead 4 days. I'm going to skip that. You've heard this story before. Gets there 4 days, and we get over into verse 17 tells us that he's been in the grave 4 days, and we know he calls him out of the grave. Verse 21, Then Martha said unto Jesus, Lord, if thou had been here, my brother would have not died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it to thee. And Jesus said unto her, Thy brother shall rise again. Martha said unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, shall live, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. And then he looked at Martha and said, Believest thou this? Do you believe what I'm telling you? He was engaging in a conversation with a woman on doctrine. He didn't do this. Rabbi priest didn't do this. And the people watching see him engaging with Martha on an issue of doctrine, which rabbis didn't do and the priests didn't do. He never engaged like this. And he asked her a question, and she answered him and says, Yes, I believe thou art the Christ, the Son of God, which should come to save the world. He elevated the status of women by engaging conversation with them on points of doctrine. He just taught Mary, Martha's sister, at his feet a few minutes ago. Let him come in. And now he's teaching Martha and engaging with Martha on these issues. Go back with me to Luke chapter 8. Luke chapter 8, beginning in 41, there's two miracles here. One about Jairus' daughter, where the Lord again, many of his miracles involved helping women and their kinfolk and healing women, as we've already seen. He healed Jairus' daughter, but that's not the one I want to talk to you about. We go down to when he was going, behold, there came a man named Jairus, and he was a ruler of the synagogue, and he fell down at Jesus' feet and besought that he would come to his house, because he had a daughter about 12 years of age. She was dying, and he wanted Jesus to come and heal her. But let's go in. And Jesus was walking toward Jairus' house to heal the daughter. Verse 43. While he was walking, and a woman having an issue of blood 12 years. She had some sort of blood-flowing problem. Most commentators speculate that it was menstrual-oriented. It could have been a hemorrhage of some kind. But nearly all the commentators indicate it was menstrual-oriented. Had spent all her living upon physicians, and nobody could heal her. 12 years she had been suffering with this problem. Again, when you were in that time of the latest time of the month, and she was for 12 years solid, you were considered unclean. You were not allowed to be involved with the other people of the Jews as long as you were unclean. So she was looked down upon, frowned upon. Must be something wrong with her. She's not even supposed to be where she is. She came up behind him while he was walking. She shouldn't be close to a rabbi. Not doing that at all. And touched the border of his garment, touched the hem of his garment, and immediately her issue of blood staunched, was healed, stopped. She was immediately healed. And Jesus said, Who touched me? He turned around and tried to find out, and he said, Who touched me? And his disciples says, We can't tell. It's too crowded around here. But he said, No, who touched me? Somebody touched me. I perceived that virtue was going out of me. I felt some healing pass out of me. When the woman saw that she was not hidden, they were going to find out who it was, she came forward, scared, trembling, falling down, declaring to him before all the people what had caused, the reason caused that she touched him, and that she was healed immediately. And he said unto her, Daughter. A real nice term for her. He wasn't mad at her. Daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace. Again, here was this woman who had been kicked out by the Jewish people because of her unclean status. Not only was she healed immediately, but he didn't reprimand her for coming up to, as he's supposed to. We shouldn't have been coming up around the women. Came up to him, and he healed her. Go to John chapter 4. This is another one that I've spoken on. Samaritan woman at the well. This is perhaps one of the better examples of how Christ respected the women of the time. I need to go speed along here. The woman at the well, the Samaritan woman at the well. And y'all know this story, and again, I spoke on it one Sunday. It's at the famous well, Jacob's well, and there's a lot of history around that particular spot. But Jesus told his disciples, I got to go through Samaria. He was going here on purpose. I have to go there. He got there at the noon hour when nobody else is at the well. It's the heat of the day. Most women come early in the morning. This one Samaritan woman comes, and we know she's got a lot of personal problems. She is a sinner, clearly. She comes, and he asked her to draw him a drink. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, verse 9, How is it thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with Samaria. Jesus violated all the norms of that day. He didn't speak to a woman. He didn't talk to a woman at all. He certainly didn't talk to a Samaritan woman of another race. Your Samaritans were the half-breeds, as they call them today, half Jewish and half Syrian. He didn't talk to them. The Jews, they were enemies. That's why the story of the Good Samaritan is such important that he taught later about our neighbors or even people we may consider our enemies. But we know that he talked to her. And this is the longest discourse we have of Jesus with anybody, and it's with a Samaritan woman with a bad background. He changed her that day. His apostles came and saw him later, and they were going to get something to eat and came back in, and he goes, well, they go, why are you talking to this woman? And he has this long discourse and give her the great course about he's the water of life, and you can get that from me. He reveals to her who he is. He didn't reveal himself openly to as many people as he did to this woman that day. And Jesus, verse 16, said, go, call thy husband and come hither. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. And Jesus says, well, thou know well you have no husband. You've had 5 husbands. And the man who you're living with now is not your husband. She said, that's true. He knows me. You notice he pointed that out. He knew who she was. He never condemned her. This is a woman, remember, she couldn't get a divorce. Men divorced her. She'd had trouble. I feel like she was probably an attractive looking lady. She had a lot of men marrying her, but then they would depart and leave her. Maybe been a feisty lady, as we might call her. But she didn't have the right to get a divorce, but she'd had 5 men now reject her. Now she was living with someone without a marriage. And yet, Jesus stopped. He elevated her status by even paying attention for her. He spent more time with her than he has any other place in the Bible explaining doctrine to her and discussing with her doctrine. And she was smarter than people might have realized one at the time. She knew they were supposed to go up in the mountain to worship, but you people in Jerusalem, y'all go to the temple. He gave her this great discourse and said, there'll be a time coming when you'll worship both in spirit and in truth. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. And he identified himself as the Messiah, the Christ. He said, I that speak am he. Women weren't to testify back in that day. They weren't allowed to testify. Yet she went into town and testified about the man she had just met, the amazing man. Women had never met a man like Christ. Throughout his history of ministry, he never condemned with them. He never made fun of them. Not once did he condemn them. He forgave them. He recognized them. He elevated their status. He changed the men's thinking about women completely. Remember when Jesus, what's the most important event in the Bible for us? Most historic, important single event? It's the resurrection, because that culminated everything. Being an old reporter myself, I would have loved to have gotten the first news of that and go out and tell people. I want to spread this news quick as I want it to be me. I want to be able to go tell everybody our Christ is resurrected. Who did Christ give that honor to? A woman. The women. You can go over there and read in Luke, I believe it's 8. First part of 8, where Jesus had a number of women that followed him around. Mary Magdalene and several others. Their names escape me now, but several women, they mentioned them specifically by name. They followed Christ around and contributed to his ministry, both in food and in monetary means, and supported him. These same women were there when he was on the cross and followed him to the tomb. And remember, after his tomb, they were ones bringing the ointment back to treat him, to take care of him. They love this man. You should too. He's done more for women's rights than anybody ever has. And the reason the Western world is like it is, as the gospel spread from the Holy Land into Greece and Rome and Europe and England and now over here in America, because of what he did, we have changed our views of women and women's rights. It started right here with him. If you don't know what it'd be if it hadn't been for him, go look at the Muslim world today, where they even practice female mutilation. It's terrible. I'm talking about where they mutilate parts of their body to keep them from having sexual enjoyment, even with their husbands. Today, they're doing that. If you want to see how much it's changed, it started right here with Christ and the respect that he gave to women. Go with me and then look at how he inspired 2 of his writers. I just want to point out a couple and close. Apostle Peter, 1 Peter chapter 3. Peter here talks about husbands and wives. Let me comment on this briefly, because again, this shows you the teachings of Christ that he gave all of us. He changed everybody, especially us men. He changed our thinking about women completely. He established the rights that they'd never had before because he elevated their status. Chapter 3 of 1 Peter, verse 1. Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. Again, he's given us our rules to live by. That if any obey not the word, they also may be without the word, be won by the conversation of the wives. If the husbands are not members of the church, maybe they'll be won over by the wives. The importance of wives is you can also win husbands, can help convert husbands who maybe not be with the word. While they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, in respect with what I would interpret that. And he speaks about women whose adorning, let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold or putting on of apparel. Now Jesus is saying, lady, he's not saying, lady, don't dress nice. It's important, I think, that you dress nice, and we've got other places where we should dress nice and dress clean. But here he's saying, that's not your beauty. Don't let that be your beauty. Here's what your beauty ought to be, but let it be the hidden man of the heart. Let it be what's in your heart. There's where your beauty lies. Let it be spiritual beauty. Nothing wrong with wearing good clothes and braiding your hair and fixing up and a little makeup. That's not what he's talking about. But don't let that be your beauty. Let your beauty be what's on the inside, in your heart, and that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of the meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God a great price. He's telling you how to be beautiful. He gets down here in verse 7. He says, likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them, the wives, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor to the wife as the weaker vessel. I'm not talking about weaker intellectually or spiritually. He's saying she's got the weaker body. We're stronger than women are. For a reason. That's our role. But he says, likewise, dwell with them according to knowledge, according to understandings. Men, understand your wives. It's a little hard for some of us. We have to work at it. Stop here and tell you a personal story real quickly. Many of you know, 14 years ago now, I lost my wife. I had my two small kids, and I went a while, continued to wear my wedding ring for a while, over a year, but I finally then decided I'd start dating. Had everybody hounded me to date the girls they wanted me to date, and tried to open up to my kids and tell them too, my son and daughter. My daughter's here this morning, and tried to tell them. And when I was finally decided to go out on a date, and went out a few different dates with different people. And my kids enjoyed that. They would always ask me, how was my date, Dad? And, and I'm going, I hadn't dated in 40 years. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how you're supposed to act. Anyway, that year for Father's Day, my kids bought me a present. Got it here with me more. I've saved it. It's a book. It's a good book. Everything Men Know About Women. Excellent book. Every page is blank. They had a good kick giving me this book. And they got a good laugh, and I did too. But it meant something to me because that's right. Most men are not doing what the Apostle Peter tells us. Know your wives. Understand your wives. They're different. We know that. We are too. They're different. But they go out of the way to say, know and understand your wife. If you know and understand your wife, then your marriage, and you give honor to her when you do that. Her opinions are important. Her life is important. What she thinks and what she does and why she does it, it's important you know and do that. You give honor unto her as the weaker vessel and as being heirs together. You are spiritual heirs together. She's on the same level as you as far as Christ is concerned. The wife and the husband are on equal levels. And as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Men, if you don't do this, your prayers could be hindered. It's one of the benefits we have and a little discipline we have. Finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one to another. Love as brethren, be pitiful and courteous. Let me go back now to Apostle Peter. Excuse me, I've been Peter. I want to go to Paul. Paul, Ephesians. And again, y'all have Ephesians chapter 5. Y'all know this one too. Ephesians chapter 5, beginning in verse 22. This is again where Apostle Paul really tells us about the relationship between men and women and the importance of the woman being equal with a husband. Wives, submit yourself unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. He's fixing to make a comparison here. It's going to be tough for us guys. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives. How? Even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify it and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church. He's talking about Christ and his church, but he's talking about husbands and wives too. That he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever hated his own flesh, but nourished and cherished it, even as the Lord the church. Love your wives like you do your own body. Love your wives as you love yourself. Totally changed the things we've been talking about this morning. Christ totally changed the realm of women in the way that men looked at women and the way all of them looked at women. Men, treat them exactly like you treat yourself. Love them exactly as much as you love yourself. We're all selfish by nature. If we are selfish by nature, we ought to be selfish to ourselves and our own wife. When you marry a wife, you become one flesh. You're not the slave of one or the other. It's not the slave of that. You don't treat them like that. You don't beat them into submission. You treat them as an equal. They're not equal. They're yourself. And that's the way we're to treat them. I want to close at Galatians. Galatians chapter 3. This is why, if I can find Galatians. Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. This is the Apostle Paul telling us about our eternal salvation. When he says, there is neither Jew nor Greek. There's no difference now between Jews and the Gentiles as to who has favor with God. There is neither bond nor free. I don't care if you're a servant or a slave or if you're a free man, you're the same to Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female. For ye all are one in Christ Jesus. And if ye be Christ, then ye are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. I created male and female for the enjoyment of each of you in this world, for the companionship and the intimacy you're to have in this world. But beyond that, you're equal. I created roles for each of you because you're different, male and female, but you're equal. Christ was the greatest advocate of women's rights. He changed the way the world thought about women, and it's had a dramatic influence on the Christian Western world ever since. If you look at the world, the countries that are based upon, and the majority of their population is based on Christian values, you'll see greater women's rights by far than you see of any other head of any other religious organization, any other major figure that's supposed to represent the start of a religion. None of them has been an advocate for women like Christ was. Christ is the women's best friend. You've been very kind with your attention. My prayer is the Lord will richly bless you. You want to close? You want me to go ahead? Okay. Brother Randall, if you'll select us a song to close the service with, we'll offer a song, give an opportunity for new members. The doors of the church are always open. If you have a desire to join the church, just come forward and let your wishes be known. After the first verse, by tradition, not required, but by tradition, we usually offer each other the right hand of fellowship, and you're welcome to participate in that. What's the number, Brother Randall? 132. Number 132. Start when you're ready, Brother Randall.